For decades, Daryl Hall and John Oates were one of music's most successful duos. They made hit after hit, performed together for years, and built a partnership that seemed almost impossible to break. But behind the music, their relationship had been falling apart long before the public knew about it. Then, in 2023, one decision changed everything. Hall was furious, and the words he used to describe what happened were stronger than anyone expected. After more than 50 years together, the two men suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of a legal battle. But what really happened between them? And why did Hall take it so personally? The surprising part of the Hall and Oates breakup is that the partnership did not suddenly fall apart when the lawsuit became public. By that point, the creative relationship between Daryl Hall and John Oates had already been fading for years. To fans, they still looked like the same successful duo. They could walk onto a stage together, perform the songs everyone knew, and continue selling out shows. But behind that public image, the relationship had changed dramatically. Hall and Oates first met as students at Temple University in Philadelphia in 1967. They came from different musical backgrounds, but they quickly discovered that their voices and musical ideas worked well together. Hall had the powerful voice that would eventually become one of the defining sounds of their biggest hits. Oates brought guitar, vocals, songwriting, and another musical perspective to the partnership. Their differences initially helped them rather than hurt them. As their careers developed, Hall became the more visible member of the duo. He sang lead on many of their biggest songs and was heavily involved in writing the material. Oates was also an important songwriter and musician, but the public often focused more attention on Hall. Their names became so closely connected that many fans simply viewed them as two parts of the same act. That public image lasted for decades. From the outside, Hall and Oates appeared to be a close musical partnership that had survived every change in the music industry. But the reality inside the partnership was very different. Hall later explained that the two had not really maintained a creative relationship for decades. According to Hall, the last song he wrote with Oates was around 2000. They could still perform together, but they were no longer regularly creating new music together. So why did they continue? Part of the answer was simple. Hall and Oates was still a successful touring act. Their audience wanted to hear the familiar songs, and there was still money to be made from performing them. As long as both men continued showing up, the public had little reason to believe that something had changed. On stage, they could still sing the songs people loved. But performing old songs together was not the same thing as being creative partners. Over time, Hall increasingly developed his own projects outside the duo. Oates did the same. Their individual careers became more important, and their interests moved in different directions. Oates also became increasingly open about being an individual artist, rather than simply thinking of himself as one half of a permanent musical unit. That difference mattered. Hall appeared to view Hall and Oates primarily through the creative work they had built together. Oates increasingly emphasized the idea that they were two separate musicians who had worked together successfully. Those two views could exist for years, but eventually they created a serious problem. By the time the legal fight became public, the lawsuit was not the beginning of the fracture. It was the moment when a problem that had existed quietly for years finally became impossible to hide. For decades, one question followed Hall and Oates wherever they went. Who was really responsible for the success of the duo? Daryl Hall was clearly the more visible member, but John Oates was never just the man standing beside him. Hall had an enormous role in the group's success. His voice became one of the most recognizable sounds in pop music, and he sang lead on many of the duo's biggest hits. He was also heavily involved in songwriting, and was often the member who received the most attention from journalists and fans. When people talked about Hall and Oates, Hall's name and image usually came first. But that does not mean Oates was simply a supporting musician. Oates played guitar, sang, wrote songs, and contributed ideas that helped shape the duo's sound. He was involved in writing several important Hall and Oates songs, including major hits that became central to their career. Oates repeatedly emphasized that he and Hall were two individual artists who worked together. He did not necessarily see their professional relationship as proof that they had to remain permanently connected. That distinction became increasingly important as they got older. Even their early career reflected this idea. Their albums were credited to Daryl Hall and John Oates rather than being presented as a single entity. From the beginning, there were two names, two musicians, and two individual identities. The problem was that success can make those distinctions harder to maintain. For Hall, the partnership could be understood as a shared creative project that had produced decades of music. Oates increasingly spoke about the relationship from a different position. He emphasized independence and his identity as an individual musician. He had his own interests, his own projects, and his own reasons for wanting to move forward. Neither position was necessarily unreasonable. The difficulty was that they could lead to very different expectations about what should happen when one person wanted to move on. That difference can remain manageable for years if both sides avoid confronting it directly. But after decades of silence, even relatively small disagreements can become much more serious. A decision that one person sees as ordinary business can feel deeply personal to the other. That appears to be what happened with Hall and Oates. The biggest sign that something had changed between Daryl Hall and John Oates was not a dramatic argument. It was the fact that they could continue working together without really being creative partners anymore. For years, Hall and Oates had built their career around making music together. They wrote songs, recorded albums, and developed a sound that made them one of the most successful duos in American pop music. But as the decades passed, that process changed. Their personal relationship became more distant, and their creative connection became much weaker. Yet, the professional partnership continued. They still toured. They still performed their biggest songs. They still appeared together in front of audiences who expected to see Hall and Oates. From the outside, there was no obvious reason to believe that the relationship had become so complicated. Hall later explained that he and Oates had not really had a creative relationship for decades. The important point is that they were still capable of performing together even though they were no longer regularly creating new music. The two men could still stand on the same stage and perform songs they had made years earlier, but the relationship that had originally produced those songs was no longer functioning in the same way. For the audience, that distinction was almost impossible to see. The songs were familiar, the performances continued, and the Hall and Oates name still had commercial value. That allowed the partnership to continue long after the creative relationship had changed. At the same time, both men were developing lives outside the duo. Hall had his own solo work and became involved in television projects. His program, Live from Daryl's House, gave audiences a chance to see him working with other musicians. Oates also pursued solo recordings and performances. He increasingly presented himself as an individual artist with his own musical interests. These separate careers made sense. Both men had reached a point where individual projects could become more important. The problem was that their shared business didn't disappear. Hall and Oates was still a successful name. There were songs to perform, business interests to manage, and financial arrangements connecting the two men. Hall later said the partnership had become restrictive. His comments suggested that continuing to operate as Hall and Oates could make it harder for both men to move forward independently. Oates approached the situation differently. His comments emphasized independence and the need to move forward with his own career. The difference may sound small, but after decades together, it mattered enormously. Hall could look at the partnership and see something that had been built together and still required mutual respect. Oates could look at the same arrangement and see two individual musicians who had reached the point where they needed to separate their interests. By November 2023, the problems between Daryl Hall and John Oates were no longer something they could manage behind the scenes. At the center of the dispute was a company called Hall Oates Enterprises. In 2023, Oates moved towards selling his interest in the company to Primary Wave Music, a major music rights company. For Oates, the transaction was part of moving forward independently. But Hall saw the situation very differently. According to Hall's court filings, The biggest problem was not simply that Oates wanted to sell his interest. It was that Hall said he had not been properly consulted. After more than 5 decades of working together, Hall expected a major decision involving their shared business to be discussed between them. Instead, he said he learned about the proposed transaction through other channels. Hall described being shocked that there had been no personal phone call or private discussion before the deal was pursued. For Hall, that turned a business decision into something much more personal. He argued that their existing agreements required his consent before Oates could sell his interest. Hall went to court in November 2023 to try to stop the transaction. His legal team argued that Oates' actions violated their long-standing agreements. Hall's court filings described the proposed sale as a serious breach of the partnership arrangement. More importantly, Hall characterized what happened as the ultimate partnership betrayal. That phrase revealed how deeply personal the dispute had become. To him, this was about trust. Hall and Oates had known each other since they were young men at Temple University. They had spent more than 50 years making records, performing together, and building a business. Whatever differences had developed, Hall apparently still believed that history meant something when a major decision had to be made. The idea that Oates could pursue a transaction without first speaking to him was deeply upsetting. The simplest way to understand Hall's position is this. After 50 years, he believed he deserved one phone call. The situation became even more serious when a Tennessee court temporarily blocked the proposed transaction. Once legal filings were submitted, the private disagreements could no longer remain private. Hall's version was deeply emotional. He believed Oates had made an enormous decision without giving him the basic courtesy of a conversation. Oates, however, did not accept Hall's characterization. His position was fundamentally different. Oates maintained that he had the right to handle his own interest and viewed his move toward independence as part of separating their professional lives. From his perspective, the fact that they had worked together for decades did not mean they had to remain permanently tied together. Oates told Rolling Stone in 2024, "Daryl and I have always called ourselves Daryl Hall and John Oates because we always wanted to be perceived as two individuals who work together. That was very important to us. This is the ultimate expression of that. That difference is crucial. There were two people involved, and they were looking at the same relationship from very different perspectives." Hall saw decades of shared work and believed that history created an obligation to communicate. Oates increasingly saw two individual artists who had reached a point where their interests needed to separate. After the lawsuit became public, Daryl Hall began speaking more openly about his relationship with John Oates. One of the most important things he said was that he and Oates had not had a real creative relationship for decades. He explained that the two had continued working and touring together, even though the songwriting partnership was essentially gone. That puts the lawsuit in a different context. Their creative relationship had already changed years earlier. Hall had continued performing with Oates because Hall and Oates remained a successful act, but he later described the arrangement as restrictive. His comments suggested that continuing to operate under the Hall and Oates name had become limiting. So, the anger surrounding the lawsuit appears to have been about something more specific than simply losing Oates as a creative partner. Hall had already accepted that their creative relationship was no longer what it had been. What seems to have hurt him was the way Oates attempted to separate their business interests. In 2025, the legal dispute finally reached its conclusion. In August 2025, Hall's attorneys notified the court that the case had received a final judgment in private arbitration, and they filed to dismiss the case. Details of the arbitration outcome were not revealed to the public, but Hall himself made it clear that a reunion was completely out of the question. When the Times asked Hall in February 2025 if the ship had sailed on mending the pair's relationship, he replied, "That ship has gone to the bottom of the ocean. I've had a lot of surprises in my life, disappointments, betrayals, so I'm kind of used to it." John Oates had already moved on, telling Rolling Stone in 2024, "As far as I'm concerned, I've moved on. I feel like I have a new lease on my creative life." In the end, Hall and Oates may have created some of their greatest music together, But their relationship ended in a way neither of them probably imagined. What happened between Daryl Hall and John Oates shows just how complicated a partnership can become after more than 50 years. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about the real lives and hidden conflicts behind music's biggest names.